Hello and welcome to part 5 of the Life of the Soviet Citizen documentary, which will consist of 2 videos. In the previous part, I talked about the first years of Soviet school. In USSR, there was no distinction between primary school, middle school and high school. The indoctrination, I mean the education path of a Soviet child, consisted of kindergarten and then 8 or 10 years of school. Most people managed to go through all those years of education staying in the same school, surrounded by the same classmates. It could very well happen that people knew each other from kindergarten and then spent 10 years of school in each other's company. Kids were pretty much assigned to a specific school and couldn't switch schools easily, if at all. There were some exceptions though. If the child's family relocated for some reason, the child switched schools. But moving to another apartment, let alone another city or another republic, was very difficult. There were some opportunities though, for example, work-related relocation, which was rare as well, unless we speak of a relocation to a place with more extreme conditions. When I was 10 years old, my parents relocated from sunny Kazakhstan to a harsh cold Siberia to take part in a big Soviet project of building BAM, which was the short of Baikal-Amur mainline railway system. So naturally I switched schools. But when we came back to my hometown 4 years later, I went back to the same school I attended before the relocation. I was even placed in the same class. There were far better quality schools available in my city, but there was absolutely no way for me to enroll in any of them. The choice of school was determined by the city area the family lived in. This rule could be circumvented, of course, if the parents had the right connections. In Soviet Union, having the right connections and the right workplace was the highest rated currency, which separated elites from the common rabble. So what did it feel like being a teenager in a Soviet school? Well, not much different from being a child. We studied even more, just as Saint Lenin, I mean Grandpa Lenin, told us to do. As we progressed through school years, we had more and more subjects to delve into and more pioneers' activities to avoid. By the last year of school, we have already had several years of algebra and geometry that were taught as 2 different subjects. Several years of physics, chemistry and biology, which included botany and anatomy, geography and economic geography. I personally enjoyed studying sciences a lot. Our school books on the subject were great in my opinion, and although the quality of teaching depended greatly on the teachers, these subjects are the reason why Soviet education was considered one of the best. I don't claim it was, since there were many problems with children who couldn't keep up or had learning disabilities. They were discarded by Soviet education system and left to drag behind the more successful students and meant to occupy the worst-paying jobs in the future. So much for the equity, I suppose. And that's the phrase I repeat a lot in my videos. No, there was no equity in Soviet Union. No, people didn't have equal outcome. And no, it was not possible to achieve it even if you kill millions, hide your country behind an iron curtain, and worship Marx, Engels and Lenin for 70 years. But I digress. Another great subject was the Russian language grammar, if you forget the fact that Russian language was forced upon people of 14 out of 15 Soviet republics. But the way we were taught the Russian grammar was, in my opinion, great. A far less useful subject was Russian literature, since it was filled with books that were not intended for children to understand or appreciate. So we were taught to write essays filled with opinions that were prescribed for us by the Soviet government. To excel in literature, you had to know exactly what was expected from you and be able to write it using perfect Russian grammar. That's it. Your own thoughts and ideas were not only discouraged, they could get you in trouble. Another questionable subject was history, and specifically the history of USSR, which was of course filled with lies and propaganda. I especially love the title of one of the books on USSR history that was intended for history teachers. It reads, USSR history from the ancient times till the end of 18th century. From the ancient times, eh? We also had workshop classes, that were the only classes that were taught separately for boys and girls. The idea was to teach boys how to work with wood, handle electricity, and to use some sort of industrial machinery if the school had access to such. Girls were supposed to learn sewing and cooking. So much for communist gender equality, I suppose. Wouldn't girls also benefit from learning how to perform basic repairs at home, how to use different tools, and how to deal with electricity? And wouldn't boys benefit from knowing how to cook food and fix a torn shirt? Of course they would, but big governmental systems don't care about what would actually benefit children. To be fair, at my school we did switch classes with the boys for 1 week, and I remember that we were taught how to approach a collapsed electric tower, and we even did some exercises, thankfully in class and not in the field. Now, 35 years later, I can safely say that this was absolutely useless piece of information, and if the rest of what they taught the boys was about the same, I don't regret we didn't attend the boys' workshop classes. Our workshop classes were not much better, and the only thing that was fun and even remotely applicable were a few workshop classes on macrame. It's a sort of art where you basically create anything from home accessories to clothing using rope and different knotting techniques. And that was only because our teacher came up with this idea, because she was passionate about the subject. We were also taught foreign languages. Usually schools offered a choice of 2 and very rarely 3 languages, mostly English and German, with a rare addition of French. The student could choose the language, or was assigned one, and had to stick with it until the end of school education, and sometimes university education as well. I was assigned to a German language group, because, as we were told, everyone wants to study English, so we will tell you who will study what. I didn't mind back then, and looking back, it didn't matter anyway, because foreign language classes in Soviet Union were nothing but a sham. The goal was for children to learn how to read and comprehend a text with the use of a dictionary. Unless, of course, it was a school that specialized in teaching a certain language, but those schools were usually not easily accessible. The situation was even worse with the local languages. May I remind you that USSR did not consist of Russia alone. It was a forced union of as many as 15 different republics. In fact, the early Soviet Russia acted as what is now called an imperialist, who either politically manipulated, bought off, or annexed the other republics into a union that largely benefited Russia. Which, by the way, happens every time when a larger country wants to swallow its smaller neighbor, who happens to be incapable of fight off the big brother. As the result of this annexation, the Russian language was slowly imposed on all the other republics, and while some of them managed to preserve their national identity and language, others struggled with it and continue to struggle even now, almost 40 years after USSR was finally allowed to die. I was born and raised in Kazakhstan, while not being ethnically Kazakh. How my family got there is a story on its own. But what I want to point out is that I witnessed firsthand how the Kazakh language was at its deathbed during the Soviet regime. When I was a child, I had several friends who were ethnic Kazakh, but none of them spoke or understood the native language. One of them was my neighbor, and I know for a fact that while her grandma spoke Kazakh, her mother only understood it, and my friend did not, nor did she want to. During my second year at school, we had Kazakh language classes that were very frustrating to me at first. As a child, I wanted to excel in every class I took at school, and when I got to the first Kazakh language homework, I realized I couldn't do it. Firstly, because the study book was atrocious, and secondly, because it was impossible to find a dictionary. Eventually, my mom took me to my Kazakh friend's home to ask her mom to help me with my homework. But later I realized homework was optional, and moreover, nobody gave a damn whether we were taught anything at all. The teacher usually spent 45 minutes chatting with the girls in the first row, and then the class was dismissed. And that happened in the actual capital city of Kazakhstan, which was back then named Alma-Ata. Now Kazakhstan has a different capital city. I don't know whether the situation was different in other cities. I have heard that more people spoke Kazakh language in their family circles in smaller towns and villages. In Almaty, we had very little exposure to the local language. And I distinctly remember that whoever spoke or understood Kazakh language was considered old-fashioned, kind of an uneducated hillbilly. While de facto Kazakh language was one of the two official languages of the Kazakh Soviet Socialist Republic, it was being actively erased from the existence. In other republics, the situation with local language was different from one to the next, and I remember that I was surprised when I first met people from other republics who were actually bilingual. In some of the republics, children were taught literature by the national writers alongside the Russian literature. Additional classes we took were the physical education classes, singing classes, and some sort of military education. At some schools, during military education classes, teenagers were taught about military tactics, the use of military equipment such as gas masks and some basic battlefield medicine, and boys were taught to handle weapons. But at my school, military science was taught by an old frustrated ex-military dude, who mainly ranted about Nazi torture chambers, holy Russian heroes who fought for our freedom, and how all the Germans and their offsprings need to be exterminated even now. That last part was very surreal experience, since no one better than I, even the one ethnic German girl in my class. Despite the fact that I'm only half German, and half Jewish, mind you, that was the first class I actually walked out of and refused to attend. I think that was the first time I dared to do something against the system. Granted, it was 1992, so no one really cared anyway. Another important part of the Soviet student life was the Vladimir Lenin All-Union Pioneer Organization membership, starting with a glorified initiation ceremony and including different activities at school and outside of school hours. The initiation ceremony was usually held on 22 of April, the birthday of our Lord and Savior, Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov, also known as Lenin. I went through that ceremony in 1986, when the communist specter was still haunting our lands. I'm sorry, I can't help but insert some of the communist buzz phrases that are etched in my brain since childhood. A specter is haunting Europe, the specter of communism, are the first words of the Communist Manifesto by Karl Marx. What amuses me the most is that the Russian word that was chosen as translation for specter was призрак, literally a ghost. So yeah, in 1986, that communist specter was already turning into a ghost, but still not giving up. So the pioneer initiation ceremony I went through was still considered one of the most important ceremonies in the Soviet child's life. It was held in the Grand Hall of the Pioneers' Palace in Almaty. And let me tell you, this Pioneer Palace was, and still is, a truly impressive building, and the Grand Hall was breathtakingly magnificent. And since we had no other opportunity to experience religious awe, this was as close to godly intimidation as a Soviet child could get. The whole ritual was purely religious, so when I call Grandpa Lenin our Lord and Savior, am I really being that sarcastic? I am absolutely convinced that communism is a religion, an opium for the masses just like any other, with the only difference being that communists were and still are too cowardly, or maybe too devious, to call their ideology what it truly is. The pioneer initiation ceremony was designed to make the children feel like they were granted access to a special club, somehow making them different from other people, and magically placed certain obligations on them. The children were joining the ranks of a very special group, and they had to live up to its standards. It took a lot of religious-style sacred objects, chants, and activities to achieve this feeling, since we were not chosen or allowed to join. We were compelled. We couldn't just say no. I don't think this possibility ever occurred to most of us. Since a very young age, we were taught about repercussions of disobedience and what it meant to be branded as problematic. I did read a story once that was posted on some Russian-speaking platform, and it looked like a true rebel story at first. The post was written by a guy who claimed that he refused to join the Pioneers organization and bravely fought off every attempt to coerce him. Interestingly, no one on that forum believed his story and people started asking questions. So he continued to insist, saying that the reason for his victory was that he had good grades, that he had achievements in sports, etc., etc. Until finally, the last piece of the puzzle was revealed. Turned out, his parents and other family members held high positions in some very scary governmental agencies. The story might be at least partly fake. We shouldn't fully trust anything, obviously. But for me, and for the people on that thread, this story made perfect sense. Modern baby communists may believe that socialism and communism mean equality for all. But the great experiment I was born into proved that there will always be elites, people who grab onto power and use it to twist reality in their favor. No matter whether that reality is called capitalism, socialism, Nordic model, Chinese model, or any other fancy word, there are always people who find the way to be more equal than others. Soviet children joined Pioneer organization around the age of 10, and since then the amount of work they had to do doubled, consuming their free time but adding nearly no benefits. For example, pioneers had to take part in Subbotniks, a compulsory event that took place on Saturday, one of our free days, when instead of resting or doing homework, we had to work for free. But that was not the only occasion when children were coerced to work for free. In Soviet Union there was an amazing term, Otrabotka in Russian, that I can only translate as "you must justify your existence by working for free." There was this notion that we're all born with a debt that we have to pay back. Not clear to whom exactly, maybe the country or society, or maybe the Soviet political nomenclatura. Another term for this type of work was socially useful labor, and it was a legacy of a certain civil conscription law that was established in the early days of Soviet Union and allowed the government to force people, even children, to work. This type of socially useful otrabotka began at school, and Subbotnik was a child's play in comparison. During the summer vacation, thankfully not every summer vacation, children had to work every day, sometimes for a week, sometimes for a whole month. It depended on school, its location, and the local politics. Otrabotka usually started around 8 o'clock and lasted until the teacher who was watching the kids decided it was enough for one day. Some kids cleaned the schoolyard and worked in the school building, and sometimes parents were given an order to join and fix whatever was broken, because as one official from the district education offices put it, who is going to clean the school and paint the walls if not the children? I remember one summer when we were ordered to gather on the other side of town every day for a week to clean some debris around some random apartment building. Shouldn't the great social government have enough money to pay dedicated workers to do the cleaning? Why didn't the residents of that building take out their own trash? We were told to arrive there by the city bus, and I remember it was a pretty hot day, and we worked for hours in the sun, and no one cared to make sure we had enough water or food. We just worked our asses off in the heat until we were dismissed. There was a certain amount of fun in doing something together outside, but there was also a feeling of meaninglessness, since there was no point in doing what we did. All the trash was back in no time. I'm not saying that working is bad for kids, quite the contrary, but it should be well organized, thought through activity that would benefit the children in some way. For example, through acquiring skills and knowledge, rather than being boring and useless. But nothing of sorts could be expected from a bureaucratic machine that was a Soviet school. But I was actually very lucky, since we only had to sweep the yard and move some trash, and that was it. In other places around Soviet Union, teens were sent to work at grocery stores, mainly to unload trucks and drag around heavy boxes. Some were sent to work at a factory, There are stories that at some factories, like those that produced canned vegetables, nearly all the work was done by kids, who were supervised by a couple of adults. I sincerely hope it was only the case during a few weeks in the summer month, but it would not surprise me if it turned out that they simply rotated children from different schools and pocketed the money. Other kids had it even worse than that. They were taken to work at a nearby kolkhoz, a Soviet-style farm, where they worked in the field for several weeks, sometimes in terrible heat, like the poor children who gathered cotton in the southern Soviet republics. Those kids were the true Soviet slaves, who worked 12 hours a day and were demanded to gather over 50 kilograms of cotton every day. While some sources claim that this practice was abandoned in the late USSR, Uzbekistan, that used to be one of the Soviet republics, continued to use forced child labor until very recently, and they passed a law that prohibited forced child labor in 2020, which happened after 13 years of international boycott of their cotton products. Turns out, the free child labor is that amazingly profitable. Some kids who worked in kolkhoz were sent there not only in the summer, but sometimes during the school year as well. Some children were paid a very small amount of money, but that was a very rare occurrence. There was no way to opt out of Otrabotka, unless the child was ill or could prove that he completed the mandatory work hours somewhere else, which was sometimes allowed. Obviously, forging certificates was a very good business for those in charge. Even after the fall of USSR, Russian children were forced to work for free, just like in old Soviet times, and parents who tried to get their children out of Otrabotka were threatened with repercussions, like for example preventing the child from advancing to the next grade. Even if this turned out to be an empty threat, teacher could make the child's life hell for disobeying. I took part in many Subbotniks and Otrabotkas, and none of them was something that adult workers couldn't do, if they only drank less cheap vodka. If there was a shortage of workers, why didn't the glorious Soviet state care to optimize the industry? But of course, child labor is cheap, and when there are no repercussions, you can make children do almost anything, and they will not complain. Sovietophiles usually claim that working for free was beneficial for us. We learned to work together in a group, and we were taught not to be lazy. But in reality, there was always a group of slackers, children who were usually underperforming at school as well. Those children tried to do everything in their power to avoid being productive, so the work was mostly done by successful students who didn't want to lose their good reputation. And that was enough for our supervisors. If the work was done, who cares who done it? Am I right? It was easier to let the slacker off the hook and be done with it. This obviously caused a lot of frustration among those who actually worked hard. But that's how everything works in socialism. Industrious people end up doing the work for themselves and for that guy, since the only thing everyone cares about is the outcome. Which reminds me of another job that was given to hard-working students. One of the ways to deal with underperforming children who ruined the class average was to assign them to a successful student. That poor successful student was forced to share the school desk with the slacker, who mainly only wanted to copy the homework. The good student was also encouraged to stay after school with a fifth leg that was attached to him and help with homework. It may sound like a good thing. Helping the weak is a good, moral thing, right? Yes, of course, but only if the weak wants to be helped and genuinely does his or her best to learn, and the whole process must be voluntary on both sides. In Soviet schools, however, the assigned underperformers were mostly the lost cases, the children who the system couldn't or didn't want to take care of. It's not a surprise that every such attempt resulted in a good student's grades going down. Isn't it ironic that Soviet education has this reputation of never leaving anyone behind and helping children to overcome difficulties? This was not true, of course. At least I never witnessed or heard of anything like additional classes for underachieving students or any other type of help, except of forcing other successful children to contribute. But I heard a lot of stories, and also witnessed them myself, of how such children were bullied by teachers. I had a friend who had a certain medical condition that made it difficult for her to use her hands properly, so she was simply branded mentally underdeveloped, which she was absolutely not, and was ignored by the school staff. We did have additional classes for the overachievers, which was a good thing, of course, although they were few and far between. Usually, anyone could attend those classes if they were interested. I remember only one extra physics class that was given during several months once a week. Our physics teacher was so amazing that the classroom was completely full every time she gave an additional lesson, even though it started at 7 a.m. in the morning. The list of extracurriculum activities that a Soviet pioneer had to take part in goes on and on, so I suggest we take a break here and talk about them in the next video. If you have any questions, please leave them in the comment section and I will do my best to answer them. Thank you for watching.